The basement of the National Archives smelled of paper dust and cold stone, a scent only those who worked among the forgotten pages of history could recognize. Henrik Dahl, the quiet archivist no one paid much attention to, spent most of his days cataloguing boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. He preferred it that way. Silence was his ally, and solitude his comfort. But on this late autumn afternoon, as rain hammered against the narrow window wells, he stumbled upon something that didn't belong to any catalogue. It was wedged behind a row of brittle ledgers, a slim, leather-bound book so worn the stitching had begun to unravel. Its cover bore faint, angular carvings, the kind Henrik had only seen in Viking-era runestones. He carried it to his desk like a fragile bird, brushing off a thin layer of dust. The symbols on the front were unmistakable, younger Futhark runes. Oddly, they weren't arranged in the usual way for a dedication or epitaph. Instead, they ran in looping patterns, almost like a poem. He flipped it open and froze. The pages were thick vellum, the ink faded but still legible, and the handwriting, meticulous, deliberate, was not a style common to any known manuscript in the archive's collection. Interspersed between the verses were crude illustrations, waves crashing against fjord cliffs, a longship with a towering dragon prow, and what looked like a burial mound crowned with carved wooden statues. Henrik's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a poetic musing about the sea. It looked like a record, or perhaps a guide. From the hallway, the muffled voices of his colleagues carried on, debates about budget cuts, upcoming exhibitions, and the usual academic gossip. Henrik barely noticed. He was already lost in the inked labyrinth of symbols, his mind racing through every fragment of Old Norse he knew. It can't be real, he told himself. Authentic Viking manuscripts this well-preserved were rare. And when they did surface, they never ended up in forgotten corners of library basements. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this book had been left here intentionally, as if it were waiting for someone patient enough, quiet enough, to find it. He traced his finger over a particular stanza, one that seemed to repeat in various forms across the pages. Where the mountain swallows the sun, and the raven's cry is thrice heard, there rests the king beneath the tide, guarded by wood and gold. The words clung to him, refusing to be dismissed. They spoke of a place, perhaps real, perhaps metaphorical, but the imagery was too precise to ignore. Henrik leaned back in his chair, listening to the creak of the old wood beneath him. He thought of the stories his grandmother told him when he was a boy, tales of a great burial ship that had never been found, said to contain the treasures of Harold the Bold, a legendary sea king who ruled both through fear and cunning. Historians debated whether Harold had even existed, but in Norway, every child grew up hearing his name. Henrik had long since learned that myths often hid truths. Truths buried beneath centuries of retelling, mistranslation, and political convenience. And here, in his hands, might be the thread that could unravel one of history's oldest knots. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Harold the Bold's life. Henrik's eyes narrowed. He could take this to his supervisor, but he already knew the reaction. Skepticism, dismissal, maybe even confiscation before he'd had a chance to study it. No, this would remain between him and the manuscript, at least for now. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the glass like an impatient summons. Henrik opened his notebook, sharpened his pencil, and began his first careful transcription. Somewhere deep in his gut, he knew this was the beginning of something that would not only consume his life, but could change the way the world saw the Vikings forever. Henrik's nights were no longer his own. The quiet archivist who once returned home at precisely 6 o'clock now lingered in the basement well past midnight, his desk lamp the only island of light in a sea of shadow. The manuscript had become an obsession, every rune a puzzle piece, every stanza a locked door that begged to be opened. The language was slippery. Though the runes were clearly younger Futhark, the syntax bent in unexpected ways. Words shifted meaning depending on their placement, and some seemed deliberately altered, as if the scribe had wanted to hide the true intent from unworthy eyes. Henrik had seen tricks like this before in medieval ciphers, but never in a Viking text. Colleagues noticed the change in him. "You're looking pale, Dahl," muttered Eric from the conservation team, passing Henrik in the hallway. "You spending nights down there with your ghosts again?" Henrik forced a smile but offered no explanation. The less they knew, the better. By the end of the third week, he had managed to translate the first full page without resorting to guesswork. The text spoke in riddles, weaving tales of a king's voyage to the far edge of Odin's breath, where the mountains swallow the dying light. But it was a phrase at the bottom of the page that stopped him cold. "The dragon sleeps where the fjord meets the raven's call." In Viking lore, dragons often referred to ships, specifically long ships with carved dragon prows meant to frighten enemies and spirits alike. If this was a reference to an actual burial ship, it was far more than just myth. Still, Henrik knew he would face ridicule if he shared his findings too soon. The academic community thrived on tearing apart bold claims, and he had no interest in becoming the latest cautionary tale of archive fever. But deep down, the decision had already been made. He would follow this trail wherever it led. He pulled a tattered copy of Old Norse poetic forms from his personal shelf and cross-referenced the stanza with coastal maps from the 10th century. Hours later, he found something. A fjord in northern Norway, long abandoned, once bore the name Hrafnskala, Raven's Call. His pulse quickened. The place still existed, though now it was nothing more than a fishing inlet with a population of less than 100. Remote, icy, and nearly forgotten, the perfect resting place for a king who wished to remain undisturbed. But secrets like this rarely stay hidden for long. The manuscript had not gone entirely unnoticed. One evening, as Henrik left the archives with his satchel tightly clutched to his side, he saw a figure leaning against the far wall of the courtyard. A man in a long coat, smoking. Their eyes met for an instant, and something in the man's expression told Henrik that this was no casual passerby. The next morning, an anonymous email arrived in his inbox. "Some things are better left buried, Mr. Dahl." Henrik closed the laptop and sat in silence. He had two choices: walk away now, leaving the manuscript to gather dust again, or press forward, knowing that someone, somewhere, was watching. He looked at the pages spread across his desk, the looping runes shimmering faintly in the lamplight, as if daring him to continue. Henrik took a deep breath and picked up his pencil. "They'll have to stop me in the fjord itself," he thought. Henrik's notes had grown into a chaotic sprawl of papers, sketches, and annotated maps. Red pencil lines traced across a laminated nautical chart of Norway's jagged northern coast, converging on one isolated inlet, Hrafnskala. The coordinates, hidden in the manuscript's verses, were almost tauntingly precise once he pieced them together. The discovery came from a stanza buried in the middle of the manuscript, a section where the writing seemed more hurried, the ink slightly smudged as if the scribe had written in haste. Count 3 tides past the raven's perch, where the sea bites stone in the dying sun, and the serpent lies beneath the silver skin of the water. Henrik had cross-referenced tidal patterns against topographic maps. And there it was, a narrow strip of the fjord where a cliff shaped like a raven's head jutted over the water. The poetry was not symbolic flourish. It was a set of navigational instructions from over 1,000 years ago. He sat back in his chair, staring at the point on the map. His pulse thudded in his ears. If this was right, the manuscript wasn't just a historical oddity. It was a treasure map, disguised as verse. But the excitement was tempered by a growing unease. He had noticed subtle signs over the past week. Books on his desk slightly out of place, the faint scent of cigarette smoke in the archive basement, and once the creak of a floorboard in the aisle behind him when he was certain he was alone. One evening, while reviewing satellite images of the fjord, his desk phone rang, a sharp, unexpected jolt in the stillness. "This is Henrik Dahl," he said, voice cautious. A pause, then a low, accented voice. "The king sleeps for a reason. Do not wake him." The line went dead. Henrik stared at the receiver, his mind racing. It was no longer paranoia. Someone else knew about Hrafnskala. The logical part of him screamed to stop. Yet another part, the part that had always been drawn to the margins of history, to the whispers no one else bothered to hear, urged him onward. That night, Henrik worked until dawn, drafting a plan. He would travel to the fjord in secrecy, telling no one at the archives. A discreet call to an old friend in Tromsø secured a small research boat, no questions asked. 2 days later, he stood at Oslo's central station with a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the manuscript wrapped in oilskin and tucked deep inside. His train ticket to Bodo felt like a one-way pass into something irreversible. As the train pulled away, Henrik gazed out the window at the passing forests, the autumn leaves burning gold in the low sun. He thought of the king, whoever he had been, and the people who had buried him with such care that his resting place remained undisturbed for over a millennium. Whatever lay beneath the waters of Hrafnskala, Henrik intended to see it with his own eyes. By the time Henrik reached Bodo, the Arctic air had a sharpness that sliced through his coat. The port town, with its huddled buildings and grey, wind-rippled harbour, felt like the edge of the world, a fitting staging ground for what he was about to attempt. He kept to himself, renting a room above a fisherman's shop. The kind of place where cash was preferred and no one asked for a surname. Every night he spread the manuscript pages across the small wooden table, cross-referencing them with tidal charts and 19th-century naval logs he'd brought on a USB drive. But even here, the shadow followed him. Twice he caught the reflection of a man in a dark parka, standing just far enough away to be unremarkable. Once, by the ferry terminal, another time near the fish market. The second time, Henrik's gut clenched. This wasn't coincidence. On the third evening, while securing his gear at the harbour, he heard a voice behind him. "You're looking for Hrafnskala, aren't you?" Henrik turned to see a broad-shouldered man with weathered skin, his beard streaked with white. The stranger wore the layered wool and oilskin of someone who'd spent decades at sea. Henrik hesitated. I don't know what you mean. The man smirked without humor. I've fished these waters 40 years. That fjord, it swallows things. Boats, men, sometimes whole winters. Whatever you think you'll find, best to leave it to the sea. Henrik met the man's eyes, searching for malice, and finding only something worse: fear. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He kept replaying the fisherman's words, but every warning only sharpened his resolve. He thought of the anonymous emails, the phone calls, the man in the courtyard. All of them wanted him to stop, which meant he was close. 2 days later, his contact from Tromsø arrived with the research boat, a sturdy, weather-worn vessel fitted with sonar equipment and a small winch. Henrik transferred his duffel aboard quickly, conscious of every eye on the dock. As they motored out into the open sea, the wind whipped foam over the bow, and the mountains rose on either side like jagged teeth. Henrik retrieved the manuscript from its oilskin wrap and traced the verse that had haunted him for weeks. Where the mountain swallows the sun, and the raven's cry is thrice heard. The cliffs ahead matched the description exactly. A crag in the shape of a raven's head loomed above the fjord mouth, its beak pointing toward the darkening water. Henrik's heart pounded. He could almost feel the weight of 1,000 years pressing down from the surrounding peaks. But just as they crossed into the fjord, a second boat appeared from behind a rocky outcrop. Black hull, no markings, moving fast. The fisherman at the helm glanced at Henrik. "You were followed," he muttered. Henrik's stomach dropped. The rival hunters weren't just watching anymore. They were here. The black-hulled boat closed the distance with unnerving speed, its engine growling low against the fjord's walls. Henrik's companion, a taciturn man named Lars, eased back the throttle of their vessel as though slowing might de-escalate whatever was about to happen. It didn't. 2 figures emerged on the deck of the other boat, both in heavy weather gear, their faces hidden under hoods. One lifted a camera with a telephoto lens and aimed it directly at Henrik. The other simply stood there, gripping the railing, the tilt of his head suggesting recognition. Henrik felt the manuscript's weight in his bag, as if the vellum itself knew it was now prey. "They're not here to fish," Lars muttered, eyes scanning the narrowing fjord. "We'll take the long way in." "The tide's on our side for now." For the next hour, the chase became a quiet war of positioning. The fjord was a labyrinth of inlets and shadowed cliffs, each turn potentially leading to an unseen dead end. The black boat would vanish behind a ridge only to reappear in the distance, tracking their every move. Henrik forced himself to focus on the task ahead. The manuscript had been clear. The burial site lay where the sea bites stone in the dying sun. According to his calculations, they had 1 tide cycle, maybe less, before the fjord's currents shifted and made the dive dangerous. By mid-afternoon, the cliffs began to steepen, towering hundreds of meters above them, their black rocks streaked with white where seabirds nested. Then Lars pointed. "There! Raven's perch." Henrik followed his gaze. The cliffside jutted outward into a massive overhang, its tip curling like a hooked beak. Waves slapped against its base, sending up bursts of spray that glistened in the pale sunlight. "This is it," Henrik whispered. Lars cut the engine, letting the boat drift. The water here was unnervingly calm, its surface a dark, glassy mirror. Henrik opened the oilskin wrap and gently unfolded the manuscript, studying the inked drawing of the longship one last time. The sonar pinged, a low, repetitive tone. Lars adjusted the scanner. Slowly, a shape began to take form on the screen. Long, narrow, symmetrical. The stern and bow were both still intact beneath layers of silt. Henrik's chest tightened. It was exactly the right dimensions for a Viking warship. "Gear up," Lars said. "We don't have long before they get here." Henrik donned the dry suit with clumsy urgency, his fingers fumbling at the zippers. The cold would be brutal, even with thermal layers, but adrenaline had already numbed his skin. He clipped on his dive mask, checked the oxygen, and gave Lars a nod. As he slipped into the water, the fjord's surface swallowed him whole. The world above disappeared, replaced by green-blue shadows and the slow churn of his own breath through the regulator. 20 meters down, the silt shifted, revealing carved timbers blackened with age. The dragon-headed prow loomed out of the murk, its jaw frozen in an eternal snarl. Henrik hovered in the water, heart pounding in awe and terror. He had found the king's ship. The cold gnawed at Henrik's bones, a creeping, insistent ache that threatened to dull his senses. Yet all discomfort was pushed to the edges of his mind as he hovered before the ship. It was colossal. Longer than any Viking vessel he had ever studied, its timbers remarkably preserved by the silt and icy water. The dragon prow's eyes were hollow, but its expression seemed alive, as though it had been waiting for him. Henrik's dive lights swept across the deck. The hull was intact, though partially collapsed inward from centuries of weight. Near the center, the faint outline of a burial mound rose from the planks, its shape eerily deliberate. He moved closer, brushing away layers of sediment, until a glint of gold shone back at him. The edge of a shield boss, etched with spiraling knotwork. He unclipped his waterproof camera and began taking photos, moving slowly to avoid disturbing the silt. Every image was proof that the manuscript had been right, proof that Harold the Bold or someone of equal legend had been laid to rest here. Something shifted in the water behind him. Henrik turned sharply, light cutting through the murk, and caught a flicker of movement. A shadow darted behind the ship's stern. His pulse spiked. He wasn't alone. For a moment there was nothing but the hiss of his regulator. Then, emerging from the gloom, came another diver. The black mask and wetsuit made them faceless, their body language calm but purposeful. They raised a hand in a gesture that could have been greeting or warning. Henrik froze. The diver pointed toward the burial mound, then toward the surface, shaking their heads slowly as if to say, "Leave it." Henrik's grip tightened on his camera. He had no intention of leaving. He turned back toward the mound and spotted something else. A small chest, its lid bound with corroded iron. Reaching out, he brushed the silt away to reveal more gold beneath. The diver surged forward, but Henrik was faster. He snapped 2 quick photographs before the other diver's gloved hand grabbed his arm. The grip was firm, insistent. Through the regulator, a muffled voice garbled something, impossible to make out. Henrik yanked free, pushing upward toward the light above. Breaking the surface, he gasped, hauling himself onto the boat's ladder. Lars pulled him aboard, eyes wide. "You weren't alone down there, were you?" Henrik ripped off his mask, still breathing hard. "No," he said, "and they don't want this found." Behind them, the black-hulled boat reappeared at the fjord's mouth. This time, it was closer. Much closer. The black-hulled boat cut through the fjord's still water with predatory precision, its bow slicing a clean wake toward them. Lars started the engine, the low rumble reverberating through the deck. "We can outrun them to open water," he said, but Henrik could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Henrik was still shaking off the cold, stripping the dry suit halfway down while his mind raced. The images on his camera were priceless and dangerous. He dug the waterproof casing from his gear and slipped the camera deep into his duffel. "No matter what happens," he told Lars, "this has to make it back to shore." The other vessel drew nearer, its crew now visible. 3 men in weather gear, one standing at the bow holding a boat hook, the others clustered near the wheelhouse. Henrik recognized the diver from below. The black mask now pushed up to reveal sharp, pale eyes. Lars pushed the throttle forward. The research boat lurched ahead, wind biting at their faces as the cliffs blurred past. The black hull matched their speed, keeping a tight pursuit through the narrowing channel. Then Henrik saw it, a side passage in the cliff wall, barely wide enough for their vessel, half hidden by shadow. "There!" he shouted over the roar of the engine. Lars hesitated for only a second before veering sharply. The hull scraped rock as they slipped into the narrow passage, the sound echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. For a moment, it felt as if the cliff would close in around them. Then they burst into a sheltered cove, the water here calmer, the air oddly still. Henrik collapsed onto the bench, breathing hard. In the sudden quiet, the fjord seemed to hold its breath. He pulled the manuscript from its oilskin and opened to the last section he had yet to fully translate. The verses here were different, less navigational, more like a confession. "Bury me where the raven watches, that my enemies may never take my crown. Let the sea guard my truth, and let the poets tell only half my tale." Henrik frowned. The last line troubled him. Only half my tale. What truth had the king wished to hide? He remembered the chest near the burial mound, the faint gleam of gold beneath the silt. There was more than treasure down there. There was a story, one deliberately erased from history. From beyond the cove, the drone of an engine grew louder. The black-hulled boat had found them. Henrik met Lars's gaze. "We can't leave without it." Lars's jaw tightened. "You're talking about going back down?" Henrik nodded. "The world knows one version of this, King. If we don't recover what's in that chest, they'll never know the truth." Lars looked toward the cove's mouth, where a dark shape was beginning to emerge. "Then we'd better be fast." The second dive was colder, darker, the fjord's light already fading as the sun sank behind the mountains. Henrik descended with deliberate speed, Lars following a few meters behind, the beam of his dive light sweeping over the dragon-headed prow like a silent salute. The burial mound loomed ahead, shadowed and solemn, the chest exactly where Henrik had left it. Silt puffed into the water as he brushed at the corroded iron bands, his gloves slipping against the slimy wood. The hinges were too far gone to force open here, so he looped a tether from Lars's gear through the chest's handles. Together, they heaved it free from the mound's side. It was heavier than Henrik expected, unnaturally so. The moment it shifted, something inside rattled with a deep, metallic clink. His mind flooded with possibilities. The king's crown, weapons of state, maybe even documents sealed against the centuries. They began their ascent, the chest dragging like an anchor, kicking harder against the pull of the water. The surface shimmered above when a sudden shadow swept across them. The other diver. This time, he came straight for Henrik, grabbing the tether and shaking his head violently. Henrik wrenched it back, bubbles streaming from his regulator. He looked the man dead in the eye through the glass of his mask, then jabbed a finger upward. This was coming with him. The diver hesitated, then released his grip and sank back into the gloom, vanishing without another gesture. Henrik didn't waste time wondering why. They broke the surface to find the black-hulled boat just beyond the cove's mouth, its engine idling like a threat. Lars hauled the chest aboard, the wood groaning under its own weight. Without a word, he turned the boat toward the open sea. The pursuit didn't come. The black hull stayed where it was, its crew watching in silence as Henrik and Lars powered out of the fjord. It was only when the cliffs fell behind them that Henrik let himself breathe. Weeks later, in the controlled quiet of a private workshop, Henrik pried open the chest. Inside was a crown of beaten gold, its edges inlaid with jet-black stones, and beneath it a bundle of wax-sealed scrolls. The first one he unrolled wasn't a proclamation of conquest or a saga of victories. It was a confession. In elegant, deliberate runes, the king described acts of betrayal, the slaughter of innocents, and his own regret in the years before his death. The burial ship had been a prison as much as a tomb, sealing away not just his body, but the truth of his reign. Henrik sat in the lamplight, the weight of the crown in his hands. He could publish everything, shatter the legend, correct the history books, force the world to see Harold the Bold as a man rather than a hero. Or he could protect the myth that had inspired centuries of pride and unity. In the end, the choice was his alone. When the news finally broke, it spoke only of the unprecedented discovery of the king's burial ship, the artifacts carefully preserved, the manuscript donated anonymously to the National Archives. No mention was made of the scrolls. Some truths, Henrik decided, were not meant to be paraded before the world. But he kept the confession in a locked drawer, knowing that someday someone else might make a different choice. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.